discuss the history of deportations in the United States and how that often creates conflict and contradicts human rights treaties. The United States has a long and complex history of deporting migrants, a practice that has often sparked controversy and raised concerns about human rights compliance. From the late 18th century to the present, deportation policies have evolved alongside shifting political, economic, and social landscapes. However, many of these policies have conflicted with international human rights treaties. Today we'll explore this history and examine the implications of U.S. deportation policies on human rights. Deportation practices in the 18th and 19th centuries. Deportation in the United States began with the Naturalization Act of 1798, which was part of the Alien and Sedition Acts. This law allowed the government to expel non-citizens deemed a threat to national security, targeting political dissidents. Although this law was primarily political, it set a precedent for using deportation as a control mechanism. The 19th century saw relatively open immigration, but the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 marked a significant shift. It was the first law to restrict immigration based on nationality and allowed for the deportation of Chinese laborers. This established the use of deportation as a tool of racial exclusion, an approach that would continue throughout U.S. history. 20th century. Formalizing deportation policies. In the early 20th century, deportation policies became more structured. The Immigration Act of 1917 expanded deportable offenses to include crimes of moral turpitude and immigration violations. During World War II, the United States introduced the Bracero program, bringing in Mexican laborers to address the worker shortage. However, this coexisted with harsh immigration enforcement. In 1954, Operation Wetback led to the mass deportation of over 1 million undocumented Mexican immigrants under extreme and often inhumane conditions. This operation raised significant human rights concerns, as it violated protections against arbitrary expulsion. Mid-20th century, Cold War deportations. During the Cold War, deportation was frequently used as a political tool. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, also known as the McCarthyan Walter Act, permitted the deportation of non-citizens based on their political beliefs, particularly targeting communist and leftist activists. These actions violated fundamental human rights, such as the freedom of thought and association, as outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The U.S. later ratified the ICCPR in 1992, further underscoring the contradiction between these deportation practices and international human rights law. Late 20th century, rise of mass deportations and detention. The 1980s and 1990s saw a sharp increase in deportations due to stricter immigration laws. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 granted legal status to some undocumented immigrants, but also ramped up immigration enforcement. In 1996, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act expanded the categories of deportable offenses and made it easier to deport non-citizens, even those with minor criminal records. This resulted in the deportation of long-term residents, often tearing families apart. These policies violated the principles of non-refoulement, which prohibits returning individuals to places where they may face persecution, a core tenet of the 1951 Refugee Convention. 21st century, expansion of deportation and ICE. The establishment of the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or otherwise known as ICE, in 2003 marked a turning point in U.S. immigration enforcement. Under the Obama administration, deportations reached record levels, with approximately 3 million people removed between 2009 and 2016. While his policies targeted criminals, many deported individuals had minor infractions. The Trump administration continued aggressive enforcement, implementing a zero-tolerance policy that led to the separation of thousands of migrant children from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border. This policy drew widespread condemnation for violating international human rights standards, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Although the U.S. has not ratified the CRC, separating families contradicts global norms of child welfare and human dignity. Human rights violations in deportation practices. The right to due process. Many deportations occur without fair hearings or legal representation. Expedited removal procedures deny migrants the opportunity to present their cases, violating Article 14 of the ICCPR. Non-refoulement. The deportation of individuals to countries where they face persecution or violence violates the principles of the non-refoulement which is essential to the Refugee Convention and the Convention Against Torture. Family unity. The separation of families during deportation contradicts the right to a family life, as established under the UDHR and the ICCPR. The Trump administration's family separation policy is a striking example. Protection of children. Migrant children often face detention in inadequate conditions. The lack of care for unaccompanied minors violates the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which calls for the best interests of the child to be prioritized. In conclusion, if we believe that human rights are universal, then no country, including the United States, should implement policies that violate these rights. The U.S. has historically used deportation as a tool of control, often disregarding international human rights obligations. These practices not only undermine the nation's moral authority, but also threaten its credibility on the global stage. To uphold its commitment to human rights, the U.S. must reform its immigration policies, ensuring due process, family unity, and protection for asylum seekers. Only by aligning its deportation policies with international human rights standards can the U.S. maintain its position as a leader in global human rights advocacy.